Lawrence of Arabia just seems to attract extraordinary interest. I was reflecting on the fact that in our time, Melvyn Bragg's show, the most popular one ever apparently was a Lawrence of Arabia outing. So this is an individual who just absolutely inspires our interest. We're delighted this evening to be joined by Robin Darwall-Smith, our archivist, to explore what can be learned about Lawrence's life from the archives, and he's going to take us through a range of objects. And I think a document's been dispatched to give you a view of what those artifacts are. Robin's actually got the objects physically with him, but we've circulated the document with images of those objects to give attendees a closer look at the details, although if you don't have that, it's not essential. And just to say again, Robin, College Archivist for Jesus and University College, and he joined us here at Jesus 2016. He's also the college historian at All Souls College, and Robin's specialist area is the history of Oxford. And having been involved in writing or editing college histories for a number of our colleges here in Oxford, including our own, on which he's been working with Felicity Hill and about to be published shortly. So it's a huge pleasure to hand over to Robin now, who will speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we will revert to Q&A, as I say. So you're all most welcome. Robin, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Nigel, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to Jesus College. Here I am in the Peter North room with Elizabeth I behind me. Now, as Nigel says, I'm coming at Lawrence from a different angle. I know very well there'll be people out there who know far more about his life than I do, and I can't really presume on that. But something I do know about is the archives of this college. And what I really wanted to do was to take you through an experiment tonight. When you have a member of this college who is as famous as Lawrence of Arabia, what can you find out about him just from our own archives? And so I'm taking you on a journey, really, starting off with the official records, and then some of the wonderful and extraordinary things which we have been given over the years. Now, you have your handouts or slides, and I hope you don't feel too much like you're back in a lecture in your college again. But if you could have perhaps turn to slide 1, and here is our first item. This is the college's admissions register, begun in 1882. And it is a wonderful volume, because every time somebody came to Jesus College, we kept a record of it. And so we have the entry for Thomas Edward Lawrence. And it's always the same. You have when he arrived, full name, date of birth, whether he's first, second, third son, then where he was born, where he lives now, where he went to school, father's name and occupation, but Lawrence's father, no occupation, whether he got a scholarship or not. And then on the second page, you can see his academic career. He got a first in modern history. And then what happened to him next? And of course, they talk about his events in the war. So for every student of Jesus College in this period, we have this level of detail. And I do maintain that our admissions register, although it's not one of the oldest things in the archives, is actually one of the most precious, because everyone gets the same treatment. You might for a moment look at the whole page and see who else is there. So we have the son of a surgeon who grew up in Barbados, the son of an inspector of inland revenue who was born in Shropshire. We have a retired schoolmaster from North Wales, and we have the son of a vicar, also from Wales. And this, of course, shows you how important the Welsh connection was to the college in Lawrence's time. And as I'm sure you know, of course, Lawrence got into this college courtesy of a Welsh exhibition because he was born in Wales. There are many things, of course, you can do with this register. You can start saying, well, what can we learn about the backgrounds of people who were at this college? What can we learn about their education? And one of the very intriguing things about Edwardian Jesus is the education. Almost no one from this period has come to us from any of the major public schools. Almost everyone at Jesus, English and Welsh alike, come from grammar schools. So I think it gave us a very special atmosphere, rather different from any of the grander colleges, which perhaps has always been something of a strength for this place. Now, let's go on to slide 3, and my heftiest book of all. Now, one of the great frustrations about being a college archivist sometimes is not so much what you have as what you don't have. So, for example, we have no academic reports of Lawrence's progress as a student here. It would be lovely to know what his tutors thought of him, but those records don't survive. We have a piece of frustration here. When Lawrence was here, the then classics tutor, a man called Ernest Jenner, spelt with a G, kept a series of notebooks in which he recorded his extremely unexpurgated thoughts on all his pupils. So if they were stupid, if they were lazy, if they were just plain idiotic, he said so. And they make a fascinating read. Now, of course, Lawrence read modern history and not classics, and so he never encountered Jenner. He might just have done. In those days, you couldn't just go straight into modern history. You had to do something else first. You had a choice of 5 terms of classics or 2 terms of law. Lawrence, clearly to get through Oxford quickly, did 2 terms of law. So we shall never know what Ernest Jenner thought of Lawrence. On the other hand, I can tell you a great deal about Lawrence's finances, because what you see here is a sample page from one of our weekly battles books. And rather at random, I chose the week ending the 21st of May, 1908. Now, people talk about the laundry list school of history. You see it before you. So if you look at the relevant page and go up a few lines, you can see Lawrence T.E. So on his food in the kitchen, he's spending 15 shillings, 3.5 pence. In the buttery, for other foods, 3 shillings, 2.5 pence. Nothing on coal, well, it's summer. Nothing on ale, nothing on groceries, nothing on postage. I suppose he can post things from home. 2.5 pence to the messenger, 2 pence on gate fees. I think that's for when he had to come in and out of college, and 3 pence on his laundry bill. And in that week, he's charged 19 shillings to 1.5 pence. So this evening, one of the significant T. Lawrence facts is that on the week ending 21st of May, 1908, his laundry bill was 3 pence. Now, I'm not being very serious there. What else can you say about a weekly battles bill? Well, to observe what he's choosing to spend his money on. So nothing much on ale, but he was known not to be much of a drinker, and you can see it there. You can also see from this, well, is he much of a big spender? And the impression you get is pretty much in the middle. I mean, there are some people, like 2 above him, someone spending twice as much, but other people spending less. So you can use things like battles books to do this, and even do a bit of myth busting. Now, as you gathered, I moonlight as the archivist of Univ as well. And I suppose a figure at Univ comparable in fascination with Lawrence of Arabia is Percy Shelley, whom Univ sent down, which is slightly unfortunate. Now, one of Shelley's friends from Univ said that Shelley lived very moderately at Univ, and everybody's quoted this, of course. A few years ago now, a biographer of Shelley came to visit me at Univ, and he said, well, here's the story. Do you believe it? I said, I don't know. Well, he said, come on, have you got any financial records? Oh, yes, I said, we do. So I went to Univ equivalents of this from 1810, and I got them out, and we looked at them together, and discovered that Shelley was the biggest spender in college almost. So there's a Shelley legend that gets blown up. So these sort of records sometimes can reveal awkward truths and smash into lovely myths. Now we're still in the realm of the laundry list with our next record. And now you're on slide 4. This is a coal book. This records, believe it or not, how much money every student on the college is spending on coal if they're living in. And you will see there is Lawrence's name, and we're in Trinity term 1908 once again. Now, okay, expenditure on coal, you think this really is getting a bit geeky. What else can you learn from it? Have a close look at this page, and you'll see numbers. You'll see a 4 and a 5, and a number by everyone's name. The coal book is recording which room everyone was living in. Now, going back to the idea of the record-keeping habit, Jesus College has never had official lists of who's occupying which rooms. But the coal books, by accident, give it to us. And so we can see from this that in 1908, here is T.E. Lawrence living in staircase 5, room 4. So the location of the T.E. Lawrence room in staircase 5 is pretty much correct. Now, these 3 records you've seen, this is typical really of any one of Lawrence's contemporaries. I can offer this level of information about anyone who was here in the Edwardian period. But Lawrence, of course, wasn't anyone. And now we're going to turn to signs of how the college dealt with him when he became much more famous. Now, after the First World War, Lawrence doesn't seem to have had a great deal to do with us. But when he was killed in his motorbike accident in May 1935, things changed a great deal. And you might now want to have slide 5 to hand. The college clearly decided they should have a portrait of Lawrence in the hall, because by this stage, there was a well-established tradition of commissioning portraits of eminent old members. Many of you, I'm sure, will remember in the hall the portrait of a rather benign elderly gent in the robes of a Lord Chancellor. That's Lord Sankey, who was one of our eminent lawyers of any generation. And in fact, there's a case where we commissioned a portrait when he was aged and full of years, and we had a grand dinner in the college at which the portrait was formally unveiled. Of course, Lawrence did not die aged and full of years. He died very suddenly, very young, in his 40s. And the college was left thinking, we need to sort this one out. And you can see in the college minutes that in July 1935, that's just 2 months after his death, the college is investigating how to buy a portrait of him. And we seem quite unashamedly to have put out feelers to London art markets and said, have you got a Lawrence painting? And luckily there was one. There was a copy of the well-known painting of Lawrence by Augustus John in the Tate, done by Alex Jennings. And she actually is the first woman artist from whom the college bought a painting. So we corresponded with Mrs. Jennings and offered her £50, and she was content to receive this. And we have these 3 rather nice letters between the college and Mrs. Jennings about her painting. So on the 6th of October, she's saying to Alfred Hazel, our principal, I should be glad to know if the Lawrence portrait has been hung. And then you can see she talks about what's being done to the Augustus John and the Tate. Then our bursar replies and says, we've had your letter, I'm enclosing your check, always important for a freelance artist. And then rather nicely, she says, the portrait has arrived and is winning general approval. It will be hung in the hall for the college Gaudy tomorrow night. And I bet the bursar was rather pleased his timing was so perfect. And then we have a nice reply from Alex Jennings saying, it is very nice of you to tell me that the portrait meets with approval. I am so glad. And of course, the portrait remains there in the hall to this day. Now that was the college dealing with how to remember Lawrence. But there was also the question of Lawrence's family. And interestingly, after Lawrence's death, we did establish good relations with the family. There was, of course, another Lawrence brother who was at this college. There was Frank Lawrence, who came up in 1913 and very sadly was killed in the First World War. There is one rather curious tale about Frank Lawrence. His full name was Frank Hellier Lawrence, because he was born when the family was in Jersey. Now, As some of you may remember, as well as having Welsh scholarships, the college used to offer Channel Islands scholarships. And so Frank Lawrence came in to Jesus on the Channel Islands scholarship. And there are probably no other pairs of brothers that came in on such different pairs of scholarships. But I digress. When Lawrence died, as I say, we kept in touch with the family and they with us. And now, if you look at the next group of slides, you will see how our keeping in terms with the family paid off. Because in December 1939, we have this letter from Montague Robert Lawrence, known as Bob, to Alfred Hazel. He says that we expect to come to Oxford very shortly to hand over my brother's Arab robes to All Souls, as they already have the dagger and head rope. And I believe they're all now deposited with the Ashmolean Museum. And Mr. Adams, who they're staying with, is the warden of All Souls. And now the important bit. Mother would very much like to give my brother's thesis to Jesus College if they will accept it. She thinks they have the best right to it because it was written for his finals while he was still at the college. So there we have the evidence of this wonderful gift from the family. And Hazel was thrilled to bits because he writes a bit later, Dear Dr. Lawrence, thank you for your letter of December the 15th. It is very nice of Mrs. Lawrence to think of giving the original of your brother's thesis to the college, and we shall be delighted to accept it. So clearly, great pleasure for Hazel. And there's one other letter here. This is from Hazel to the then fellow librarian, Claude Hurst, who was our physics fellow for many years, and whom some of you may remember. And he says that he's going to send the thesis over. It's currently being looked at by John Baker, our bursar and fellow of many years. And then he says, when it comes back, I will hand it to you, and it might well go in the glass case in the old library. Well, that glass case has long gone, but we have the thesis. Well, actually, I don't have the thesis. This is a facsimile of it. Just a few years ago, our librarian, Owen McKnight, thought it was a good idea if we commissioned a facsimile of the thesis so that people could look at it and turn the pages without damaging the original. And it is a very splendid piece of work. You have to look quite hard to realize it's not the original. So, of course, in slide 9, you see the title page in Lawrence's handwriting. And then I thought, well, what can I show you in the way of illustration? And I found an opening which rather tickled me. You'll see that on slides 10 and 11. And it's showing one of the castles that Lawrence visited on his travels. For, as you may have gathered, he wrote this optional thesis based on Crusader castles, based on his travels in France and in the Middle East. And here is a castle in Antioch called Saone. I don't know how it's really pronounced. And on one page, you see a photograph, and on the other, you see plans of it. And then I think on the facing page, here is when Lawrence is a little naughty. There is the footnote. There is a lusty colony of snakes on the ground floor, preventing exact measurement, above all, since it is in total darkness. And then at a later point, he adds in pencil, no putties. Now, why did Lawrence have to bother to do that? He didn't need to. It feels to me like he's just sort of making the examiners have a little frisson and sort of, oh, that's a bit naughty of him. Mind you, the thesis itself is a remarkable piece of work because, in a wonderful way, it was utterly unnecessary. In Lawrence's time, a history thesis was entirely optional. You get a first just on the basis of doing good papers. And if you did do your thesis, well, you could do something like perhaps analyze a corpus of medieval records. But the fact that, as Lawrence did, you hop on your bike and travel around the Middle East, which in those days was an area not really visited by many people from the West. That was just astonishing and daring beyond all description. And you have to admire Lawrence's determination to do it. Well, I should say that people realized Lawrence was something out of the ordinary. From the reaction, he got a superb first. And then he got something else too. Magdalen made him a senior demai. Okay, you'll say, what's a senior demiship? Well, in those days, there wasn't really much interest in postgraduate research. Remember that the DPhil didn't come in until 1917. And even then, a doctorate wasn't really essential for a budding academic until well after the Second World War. What tended to happen quite often was that somebody would get a brilliant degree, and then after a year or two, there'd be a fellowship available, and he'd get sort of put into it. He'd stand elected. And in a way, the senior demiships at Magdalen were intended to help people who wanted to get a fellowship if they could, but needed means of hanging around in Oxford, waiting for that opening, waiting to sort of apply for what was going on. There weren't very many of them, and so for Lawrence to get such a post was really a considerable sign of the way that people regarded him. And of course, many of you will know that this is the time when Lawrence did quite a lot of his archaeological work out in Carchemish, all being funded by his post at Magdalen. And I'm sure some of you must have wondered, as I do wonder, if there hadn't been a First World War, would Lawrence have gone on to become a major archaeologist? Because there he is in 1912, 13, 14. He's all set up. He's on the first rungs of the career. There is actually a rather nice detail about this here in Jesus. The Jesus College magazine, then as now, would sometimes have news of old members. And you find in a very early Jesus College magazine, we're reporting that T.E. Lawrence is excavating at Carchemish. So we know what he's up to. And as I say, clearly he's going to become, we think, a young archaeologist, a bit like Leonard Woolley, who was also at Carchemish too. But of course, that never happened, and his life went in a completely other direction. And now I come to some very different sorts of records. You've seen most of what you have has been official records, apart from the thesis. You've seen Lawrence recorded in our student records. You've seen the way that our principals and bursars correspondence files record things to do with Lawrence. And actually, one thing about those principals files is we're lucky to have them because there are gaps. Some of you I know will know well the bust of Lawrence in our chapel. Very sadly, we have no correspondence about that. We have to piece together how we got it from mentions in the college record and from mentions in the governing body minutes, which show it came to us in the early 1960s, once again through the Lawrence family. But now for a very different gift. This owes its origins to a remarkable Australian lady called Mary Wentworth Kelly. She was wealthy, and she became very interested in Lawrence of Arabia. And rather out of the blue, in 1964, she wrote to our then principal, John Christie, and said, I would like to give Jesus College something to do with Lawrence of Arabia. I was thinking, she said, perhaps of trying to find a copy of the first signed editions of the 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Well, of course, Principal Christie was rather excited at this and said, yes, please. Well, in the end, Mary Wentworth Kelly couldn't find a copy of the 7 Pillars of Wisdom first edition, but she gave us something else. She negotiated with the Lawrence trustees and bought about 100 original letters from him, which she presented in 1965. And here you have slide 12. In some ways, it's a rather curious gift. because these letters have nothing to do with Lawrence's time at Jesus College. They all date from after the First World War, and almost all of them are written to a chap called Robin Buxton. Buxton was never a part of Lawrence's Oxford life. He'd been a banker, and during the First World War, he served in the Middle East, and that's how he and Lawrence got to know each other. And after the First World War, Buxton returned to being a banker, and effectively, as many of you will know, he became Lawrence's banker, trying to sort out Lawrence's rather chaotic finances. And these letters, therefore, are very significant for Lawrence's financial affairs. There's a huge amount in them about trying to get that first edition of the 7 Pillars of Wisdom published. And you can see the immense agonies that Lawrence went through, the costs of commissioning portraits, occasionally, dare I say it, discouraging certain people from being allowed to buy copies because he doesn't like them very much. Lawrence really seems to have had no head for being a businessman. And in the middle of all these letters, there is the one you see here. When I became Archivist of Jesus College, of course, I spent time looking at all our catalogues and wanting to find out what were the exciting things. And when you see you have 100 odd letters from Lawrence of Arabia, you think, this is exciting, I'm going to have a look at it. So I went to the relevant box, pulled it out, turned the pages, and then my eye was caught by this. And I'm sure your eye has been caught by the phrase opening the second paragraph. The bike has come yesterday and is a man killer. Magnificent. Well, a slight chill ran down my spine when I thought of what killed Lawrence in the end. But here it all is. And strange premonition almost. These letters have been read, I know, and some like Jeremy Wilson in his major biography of Lawrence used them, but a lot of them have never yet been published. But here they are in our archives. Now, Mary Wentworth Kelly's generosity to the college did not stop there. She bequeathed us money to go into a trust fund. And there is the T.E. Lawrence Award for Medieval History, which perhaps some of you were awarded during your time here. So Mary Wentworth Kelly is in many ways a kind benefactor to the college, both in money and indeed in kind, like this. Now, this is going outside the archive a bit now, but one thing about a college like ours is we have publications. It used to be the Jesus College magazine, and now it's the Jesus College Record. And these can offer insights into famous alumni, which other people can't. Going through the old magazines and records in search of Lawrence of Arabia is an intriguing business. I told you about his mention of excavating in Carchemish. In the Jesus College magazine of 1913 is a little piece of sort of fiction by him set in the Middle East. When Lawrence was killed in 1935, the then Jesus College magazine had a big obituary for him, with a photograph. And over the years, people have contributed articles about aspects of his life. But undoubtedly, the most remarkable instance of this comes from the Jesus College record of 1986. Here it is, not quite so glossy as the records are today. This record was edited by John Griffith, our very long-standing classics fellow, who I'm sure some of you remember. And actually, I remember him too, as I better own up here that, as well as being Archivist of Univ, that's where I was an undergraduate reading classics. And John Griffith, in his retirement, taught me Greek and Latin prose. And so, like many of you, I have my own reasons to remember him fondly. But one thing John Griffith did in 1986 was to realize there were two members of the college who were contemporaries of Lawrence, and in their late 90s, they were still alive. One was Warren Alt, and you will see from slide 13 that He was our first Rhodes Scholar, an eminent historian in his own right, an honorary fellow. And the other was Arthur Price Jones. And here they were in their late 90s, still on splendid form. And John Griffith got them to write about themselves. And so we start off with Warren Alt, who says how he remembers, my most enjoyable moments with Lawrence were the visits we made by bicycle to the village churches near Oxford. Lawrence knew the countryside well. We were looking for any brasses they might have. Lawrence supplied the paper and lead Ball needed to make rubbings. We collected quite a roll of them. Lawrence carried a screwdriver in his back pocket to remove a brass he suspected might have an earlier portrait on the other side. I was posted at the lich gate to give the alarm in case anyone appeared. Then he goes on, our most ambitious project was to make a rubbing of the large brass of an early 15th century Archbishop of Dublin, which lay on the floor of New College Chapel. We thought it wise to obtain permission, so I wrote to Warden Spooner, and he assented readily. And you recall, he says how the brass now hangs on the wall of his study. Well, as John Griffith noted, very soon after that, Alt and his family very kindly loaned the brass rubbing to the college. And I'm very pleased to say we still have it, for it's up there in staircase 5 near the T.E. Lawrence room, and no doubt some of you may have seen it. And it's a rather charming memorial to one of Lawrence's unlikely friendships. Now, the other unlikely friendship was Arthur Price Jones, who writes at much greater length and in more detail. And he remembers many things about Lawrence, how Lawrence would sit cross-legged on the floor. He never sat on chairs if he could help it. He said, Price Jones says, he never indulged in the meals known as breakfast, lunch, tea, and dinner, nor smoked, nor took drinks. Now, here's a very good case where the old financial records can help. Because do you remember that Lawrence was spending money on food? So quite, what is going on here? Lawrence is clearly spending money on food like everyone else, and yet he has this mystique, he doesn't bother. I don't know where to go with that one, but I throw it out to you as a little tale. But Lawrence, according to Price Jones, was regarded as a bit of an eccentricity. He recalls how once when Lawrence had been spending time with him, as he puts it, a very normal, intimate friend of mine dropped in. He was a typical rowing and rugger man of the old school, a stalwart upholder of tradition and correctness in all things, superlatively honest, dependable and loyal. In his blunt Anglo-Saxon way, he said, I've just passed that lunatic Lawrence on the staircase. What's he been doing in our territory? Seeing me, I replied. My God, Price, the man's balmy, don't you know that? Well, I said, either that or some kind of genius, I can't tell yet. Give me time, old man, I've only just met him. You Welshmen do seem to have the knack of picking up the queerest fish. I know he's balmy. He doesn't run with the boats. He doesn't play anything. He just messes around on an awful drop-handed bicycle. And if he ever wore a bowler hat, he'd wear it with brown boots. Well, well, I said, that of course is perfectly dreadful. But he's got the most charming manners, probably a first-class brain, and he's refreshingly out of the ordinary. He'll always be plain balmy to me, was the uncompromising reply. Well, I have to say, Price Jones's memoir makes tremendous reading. But this is, of course, Arthur Price Jones writing in the mid-1980s. This is almost 8 decades after he and Lawrence were undergraduate friends. And you always have to ask yourself, with reminiscences like these, quite sort of, have they been gilded a bit? You can imagine people like Warren Alt or Arthur Price Jones, it's being known that they were at Jesus College with T.E. Lawrence. You can imagine friends or children or grandchildren, of course, saying, oh, please tell us, Grandad, what was T.E. Lawrence really like? And so for someone like Arthur Price Jones, there were, I suspect, many opportunities to gild a tale. So quite whether the conversation I've just retailed really happened or not, who's to say? Nevertheless, though, Price Jones's point that Lawrence was deemed a bit eccentric by his colleagues, I think we may take that as true. But maybe, as I say, by the 1980s, there had been opportunities to gild the myth a bit. Now, I end with perhaps the strangest story of the lot. You've seen records from our college publications, gifts from benefactors who've actually said, do we want them? What follows now is this quite strange collection of typescripts. In 2018, the college got an email and a letter from the executors of a Mrs. Leslie Brown and a Mr. Peter Brown. Mr. Brown was offering us books. Mrs. Brown's family had spotted papers, and they both lived in Hastings. So I contacted the family of Mrs. Brown and said, I'm interested. Now, it so happens that my mother lives on the Sussex coast, so Hastings isn't so out of my way. So 2 years ago, on a really horrible November day, there I was in a caravan park on the outskirts of Hastings, and I entered this park home, which was musty, dusty, unloved. There was a portrait of Lawrence of Arabia done by Mrs. Brown. There were photocopies of articles. She even had a photocopy of our article from the 1913 Jesus College magazine. And there was a complete typescript, day-by-day chronology of Lawrence's life. And in the last slides, you see samples of this from Lawrence's wandering around France in the summer of 1908. And it is, you're thinking, gosh, this is quite extraordinary, because of course, this is all pre-internet. It's her and her typewriter and books. And then there was the question of Mr. Brown's books, and we'd all got confused. I thought we were dealing with the same people. But when I corresponded with Mr. Brown's executive, they said, oh no, this is something else altogether. So another trip to Hastings was in order to collect Mr. Brown's books. Now, Owen and I had no great expectations. We thought it would be lovely if there were a few more books by and about Lawrence for the college library. That's always very welcome. And I had no great expectations until my car had about the 6th box of books and was starting to get rather weighed down. So I brought all the books back to our library and put them on the floor, and Owen and I, after a moment, were just left astonished. We had a wondrous collection of books by and about Lawrence. We had all the major editions of his works, the major editions of letters, all the major biographies. We had rather unusual things like a little monograph discussing his medals and other orders. We had, rather more unusually, some novels written very much in the best Dawnford Yeats or Sapper style about Lawrence, being with Lawrence out in the desert, doing things to the Turks, which are probably desperately unsung to read now. Most curiously of all, we had a volume of communications from Lawrence purporting to come from the other side. That one rather tickled Owen, because in the Jesus College library cataloguing system, there is actually a special code for indicating books like that sort, and he never catalogued that before. So we were thinking, what do we have? We have the papers, we have the books. And bit by bit, by talking to the two families, it made sense that Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown had been married. They were dog breeders. They bred Basenjis. Some of you may know Basenjis. They're rather a rare dog in this country. And they were among the few people that could breed them most successfully. Mrs. Brown became very interested in Lawrence of Arabia, and she and her husband acquired this amazing collection of books. And we know from things that came out of the papers that they had been corresponding with booksellers really specializing in books on Middle Eastern studies. And she also was borrowing books quite a lot from the Hastings Public Library. But very sadly, it seems that Mr. Brown gradually felt edged out by Lawrence of Arabia. That's certainly what his family told me. And there was a divorce. And Mr. Brown rather felt that because his money had bought the books, he was taking the books. And Mrs. Brown had the papers. They stayed in touch regularly. He visited her daily. And they died within weeks of each other. So it's a strange, wondrous, sad story. And what of the result? Well, her work is certainly very meticulous. You may have noticed that in the handouts I've given you, there are, at the end of each extract, little sort of handouts in red ink. So for entry on the 3rd of August, after quotation from a letter, you have let.h. P67. Now, alongside the day-by-day chronology, I have from Mrs. Brown a great card index file which explains exactly what these abbreviations are. So I can go and look up let H in the card index, and I can see what book she's referring to. And here it all remains in the archives. And it remains an enigma to me. Owen and I were looking through past issues of the magazines of the T.E. Lawrence Society, and the name of Leslie Brown was not there, and I would be delighted if anyone listening could put me right on that one. But she was there in Hastings producing this remarkable piece of work. And it's tantalizing because I don't know how good it is. When lockdown is over, when I can once again have the pleasure of welcoming people back to the archives, I would love to have a T. Lawrence authority look at Mrs. Brown's chronology and tell me just of its worth. Do I have something new for Lawrence scholarship? Do I have the equivalent of a Forth bridge made out of matchsticks? I don't know. But I do know that I'm very glad I have it as an extraordinary memorial to one person's fascination by Lawrence of Arabia. And there, my story ends for now. I don't doubt that in years to come, other people will give us documents, books, papers about T.E. Lawrence, and we look forward to receiving them. But for now, thank you all very much for listening to me.